Hello, everyone. Welcome to Talking Logistics, where we have conversations with thought leaders and newsmakers in the supply chain logistics industry. It's my great pleasure to welcome to the program Steve Rates, who's Director of Research and Market Intelligence at C.H. Robinson. And today we're going to talk about 4 pillars to a successful transportation experience. Now, we all know that transportation is a highly cyclical and dynamic market, with rates and capacity and demand, changing over time. And, you can either be reactive and think and act, in the short term, or you can, put together a framework and a foundation to be successful in any environment over the long term. So what are the, key elements of that framework and that foundation to enable long-term success? Well, that's the key question that we're going to address in today's episode. And it's great to have Steve, back in the program to share his advice and insights on this topic, based on the research that he's done and his work with clients in this area. So, Steve, welcome back to the program.
Thanks, Adrian. Happy to be back.
So, Steve, it's been a while since you've been on the program. So welcome back. And before we dive into the topic, tell us briefly, about your role and responsibilities there at C.H. Robinson. What type of research do you focus on, and how do you execute it, and ultimately why?
Sure. Thanks. Yeah, the work that, if you think of my role at C.H. Robinson, when we say research and market intelligence, it's really understanding what are the dynamics in the marketplace today that are influencing and shaping transportation broadly. Those things that are both disruptive and also very evolutionary in terms of getting how transportation can really create value across the supply chain, driving real business outcomes. And so we do primary and secondary research. The primary research thus far has been really in the truckload space, a little bit in the LTL space, where we're using data to really correlate strategies and attributes of freight to outcomes so that we can really understand, despite the economic cycles or the freight cycles, what are those things that we know are strongly correlated to success.
Yeah, no, that's great. Certainly that's the role that, industry analysts play, right? Trying to kind of keep a pulse on what's happening in the market and try to understand, what are those factors that lead to success. And I always, tip my hat to organizations, whether they're shippers, manufacturers, retailers that have internal research organizations, as well as, logistics service providers to do the same, because I think it is, a critical aspect to really gather that data, that intelligence, not only for your own internal operations, obviously, but to be able to then provide that as a value add, to your clients.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Transportation, especially now in a somewhat tight market that we're, going through this cycle, you don't have to necessarily be victim to the market. I think everybody's going to feel the market shift and the tension, but I think the idea is with the right strategies, you can influence how you feel that market. And I think that the things we're going to talk about is what we've seen working with shippers to get, quite frankly, the best out of any market. And very often as we talk about this is, when you say best, it's not about leveraging position on a supplier community. It is truly creating value for the entire portfolio of participants, the asset suppliers, brokerage as us in the middle as example, or not in the middle, depending on what your strategies are, and then ultimately the shipper as well and their end customers. So it's, if you're looking for sustainable performance, predictable costs, these are the things what we're going to talk about that we think help with that, regardless of the cycle.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that ultimate goal of trying to, be collaborative and kind of take a win-win, approach is ultimately the best, foundation there versus the market, the pendulum's on my side. So, it's like I win, you lose. And then, that the pendulum's going to swing the other way ultimately. And people remember on the other side how you treated them. So that's always comes back around to haunt you. So one area that you've researched is obviously, what it takes to create and maintain a successful, transportation experience. And you've defined, 4 pillars. So let's discuss, each of those pillars, starting with, portfolio strategy.
Yeah.
What does that mean? And, why is it important?
Yeah. So a portfolio strategy, really what it starts with, first of all, is understanding that a business usually has more than one supply chain. At minimum, most businesses have 2, an inbound and an outbound. And seldom really do they need the same transportation strategy. You've got different different drivers to demand signals, different opportunities for consolidation or not. You've got reorder behaviors that are driven by customers or your own internal people, different geographies. And so you have to look at those. And even within one of those two supply chains, let's say like your outbound finished goods supply chain, you might have regional demands, cyclical demands, certain product line demands, and looking at those various elements of supply chain to say the attributes of this segment of the supply chain look like this, and the attributes of the other segment looks like this, and then align those segments and those demands that are being placed on transportation with the right service provider communities. And a service provider community means both asset and non-asset based, large service providers to small service providers. In today's marketplace, across the portfolio of modes, the service provider community has moved to new levels of sophistication and interest of what creates value for them. So if we go to one thing that's today's hottest part of the market, of course, is truckload, as we're going through this significant shift, right? Understand that carriers today are far more sophisticated than they were even 5-10 years ago, using yield management software, optimizing to the driver and to the week, right? So that drivers get the miles out of the week they need for compensation, get home when they want, and carriers are looking to build that yield return out of their fleet. And some freight is not attractive to some carriers, but it's attractive to others. Some's attractive to large carriers, and some's attractive to the smaller carriers. So how do you segment your business and go at the service provider community so that it aligns with the demands you're placing on transportation? That's really what the first pillar is about, is all of that work to understand what your supply chain asks of transportation and the portfolio of service providers you have available to respond to it.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I mean, a lot of times, you see, over the years, I've seen situations where, you've got, two different business units or even product groups that are using the same carriers, but they have separate contracts with those carriers, as an example.
Yeah.
So they're not even looking at it, holistically,
right.
From that standpoint. And even when you talk about, portfolio approach, I mean, I've seen others really think about the modes that they use in a more holistic manner, right? So in terms of saying, I'm only going to think about ocean, or I'm only going to think about parcel, right. I'm only going to think about LTL, and I'm only going to think truckload. It's really taking a step back. And I think to your point, it's really understanding what are the needs of the end-to-end supply chain, the full needs from how to get product from the origin to final destination, and kind of approaching it more holistically, because it might be a combination of different modes that might be the best fit for that,
That's
right?
That's absolutely right. You're right. And you'd be surprised that some of the things that are happening in one mode might be attractive in another. You talk like ocean you were talking about. I've sat with clients who simply said, I want to use the asset carriers directly for this percentage of my business, but this other area over here, I really don't want to manage. So I want to use an NVOCC, right? So build a strategy using a portfolio of the smaller carriers that helps meet my needs. So this is part of the idea is understanding those different pieces of your business and how do you get the most out of this very big marketplace of service providers that are out there. And again, especially in truckload, because it is so diverse with, well over a couple 100,000 for-hire carriers. You really need some strategy to go at that.
Right. No, absolutely. And so kind of that builds on to the kind of the second pillar, which is, speaking of strategy, is, transportation strategies. I mean, there are many, as we just talked about, I mean, there are many transportation strategies that companies can take. But, what insights come from your research in terms of kind of what goes into thinking which one's the right one for your company? And are you seeing more companies, for example, taking a transportation as a competitive weapon type of strategy?
Yeah, well, I think I like how you phrase that, because transportation in the end oftentimes is the final mile to the end customer as well. So when you say a competitive weapon, it is a way to think about it. One of the things that we're finding when we talk about the strategy, this really gets into some of the research we've done, where we look at the attributes of freight and the strategies that a shipper community can employ to really get the most of the market. So in that first pillar, once you've decided how to segment your supply chain and who you want to work with, now it's how do you go to market with your freight? How do you describe it to get, quite frankly, take advantage of what you do well in the service provider community, because you'll get reward for that. And then the stuff that really maybe makes your freight less than attractive, or it's a subsegment of your freight, at least being upfront with your service provider community so you don't have unplanned disruptions or costs. And so some of the things that we've studied that ladder up into this, that describe the freight and how you go to market with your freight, is lead time. How much lead time do you give to a service provider before it is required to pick up? It matters. As carriers especially, and I'll default to truckload conversation today just because this is where the market is really tense at the moment. A lot of shippers are worried about their budgets, not being satisfied today, is carriers are planning loads in advance, multiple legs, as I said, planning a week ahead if they can. So the more lead time you give, the more likely you will have that the service provider will accept that tender and do it at the price you want it, versus reject the tender and you have to go to the next most expensive carrier or broker, right? So lead time matters. Dwell time, we've studied that. How, especially in your live load environment, how long do you take to load or unload a truck? We've seen that there's a direct correlation to tender acceptance of shipments and price, and ultimately the price you pay with dwell time. That the service provider community is taking a look at those non-revenue generating hours and minutes and saying, this is a less attractive piece of freight than another shipper. Very regional sensitive, by the way. If you're in an oversupplied market, you have a little more latitude on dwell time. If you're in an undersupplied market, you'll probably see your route guide underperform. We also see smoothness of demand show up in a lot of our research. So as the carrier community is trying to be very thoughtful about planning these multi-legged runs over the course of a week, knowing that freight is coming at them, even before it's tendered, is directly correlated to tender acceptance again. And what we see, and I should say in all of this research, is a key driver to missing a freight budget if you're a shipper is the service provider you tendered the shipment to, if they decline the tender and you have to go to the next carrier in the route guide, as example, or broker, that's where you start to spend more money. So you're trying to minimize that. So smooth demand is very important. There's strategies like aggregating volume lanes together into a common corridor that could help there. So we talk about lead time, we talk about dwell time, we talk about smooth demand. Another one that we see is how old pricing is. We've seen a direct correlation to fresh pricing and the performance of the route guide versus old pricing. About a year is what the marketplace seems to tolerate for fresh pricing. You start to see rejection of tenders go up, and you start to see substitution of your route guide as pricing ages. So those are probably some of the top things. If you're doing multi-stop loads, how you describe those to the marketplace. There are, in fact, best strategies around multi-stop loads. Clustered deliveries in a tight market do better than multi-stops across a long distance. It gets down to, again, effective use of the fleet, risk of disruption, things of that nature. So those are the kind of things that we've been studying that really do seem to matter in the performance of route guide. And they seem to, because we try to control for economic cycles in the research, regardless of the cycle we're in, up or down, you get better performance if you're managing to those things and they're well displayed to the customer, or the carrier, I mean.
It sounds like, one of the common threads among all the things that you just said there, or a critical attribute, is, the importance of ongoing communication and collaboration and transparency of what's going on. Because what ultimately happens, I think, in a lot of cases, what I see is, you do the procurement engagement, right, where you share with the carrier, okay, this is my forecast, if you will, of what I expect to do on this lane, how many truckloads I'm going to need, so on and so forth. But, obviously, over the course of time, that all changes, right? Your demand may go significantly up or significantly down. And one of the things that I know from years ago, there was a lot of talk, but I still haven't seen much, success stories in this area. Many shippers doing it is, the ability to share demand forecasts with carriers kind of on a rolling basis to give them as much, lead time, if you will, much visibility in terms of, hey, things are heating up. We expect things to heat up down the road, or we expect things to contract down the road. And that provides the carriers with some, insight that then they can start adjusting their networks accordingly, because now they know that they're going to need to, allocate more volume or more trucks, to your business. Or they say, okay, we thought you were going to need 10 truckloads, but now you're probably only going to need 7.
Right.
Now we can readjust that. So do you see that? I mean, as part of, the communication, collaboration, trying to do that on a somewhat of a regular cadence?
Yeah, we really do. Frankly, what we see in the data is even if a shipper has a very short lead time, if they've got a strong pattern of smooth demand, right, so that the service provider community really can predict that tenders are going to come to them. They're planning capacity to be available, right? Because they know the demand is predictable. Even if the tenders are dropped on the service provider same day or day before, which is pretty short lead time, as long as that demand pattern is consistent, it gives the shipper a great deal of flexibility on the tender. Yeah, it's visibility of the history and the confidence that history will pertain. That's the predominant. If that is not known, then the lead time, so that the service provider community can respond to that and build it into their routes, is really what needs to happen. Yeah.
Right, right. Well, I guess that leads us into the kind of the third pillar, right, which is supply chain collaboration. Again, a topic that historically there's been a lot of talk, but not as much walk or enough action in there. I mean, what are the leaders doing, in this area, and how do they overcome kind of some of the barriers to collaboration?
Yeah, so you raise a really good point, and you and I talked about this when we prepped for this call. It's kind of interesting. Our experiences have been in common. Historically, transportation has been a function that is responsive to the balance of supply chain, to all the other functions. And what's happened, of course, is supply chain has moved up into the executive suite of businesses now. Transportation and logistics operations are joining, supply chain broadly in the business strategy. So the best in class, what we're seeing people do is where transportation has a seat at those strategy conversations with the other functions of supply chain, and where transportation can explain the relationship between a decision that's made in manufacturing or production or package design or customer service or sales, and how it cascades to transportation. And I think what we've found, what you and I were sharing in our previous conversation, is we've found situations where assumptions were made about transportation by another function that, quite frankly, were false. Or they assumed you need all this extra information before transportation can do something effectively with it, and realizing there's a certain amount of information that's needed, but there's a lot of information that isn't to satisfy the rest of supply chain. And so it's those conversations and that collaboration that makes sure that transportation, quite frankly, delights the rest of the supply chain and the end customer experience.
Yeah, that's a great point. I can't tell you how many times, I've heard from transportation executives say, we're always the last to know, right? And then we're expected to be the heroes at the end of the day. And more often than not, we are, but at a cost, right? Or at a level of frustration, or ultimately sometimes we can't be the hero, right? And the customer ultimately, pays the price, or we fall short on customer satisfaction, or whatever the case might be. So I think your point is right on. I think I see the same thing from the leaders as well, as really bringing transportation in to the table, have them provide their input in terms of some of the decisions that are being made, so that it goes back to kind of the balanced scorecard approach, if you will, so that everybody understands what the trade-offs are, and that transportation is not surprised at the 11th hour with them having to find extra capacity, or have to expedite something in order to fulfill a promise that was made further upstream.
And it might be, now is a better time than ever in the history of this conversation of collaboration, in that we as consumers of transportation and goods and such, we have new expectations about immediacy of response, right? And even when we do rideshare type situations, or taxi cab as example, we're now used to seeing on an app that says there's capacity sitting here, and capacity comes and goes with a great deal of elasticity, because we're using capacity, our personal cars as example, that quite frankly are about 90% unutilized, maybe even more in a lot of situations. But trucking isn't that way. Trucking, by most estimates, is almost at about 100% utilization today, meaning that really all the revenue generating miles and hours that can be had are largely being optimized today. And you can debate if that's off by a few percent or whatever. That's fine. All the analysts can debate that. But in the end, everybody agrees a very high level of utilization. So trucks aren't just sitting around, is the point. And the strategy of what transportation is capable of and not capable of is very critical, in supply chain. And frankly, transportation, even in this highly optimized environment, is very capable. It just requires the collaboration.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And that brings us to the fourth pillar, which is kind of near and dear to my heart. And that is, TMS, transportation management systems and business processes.
Mm-hmm.
So, how does a TMS enable a successful transportation experience from your perspective?
Yeah, really, from our perspective, what we've seen is that you can't even do the previous three pillars without a TMS. In other words, how do you really manage and view the different segments of your supply chain if you can't actually manage them in a live time frame, do the business analytics on them, and so forth? You can't hold your supplier base accountable for what they've committed to. You can't even measure your internal supply chain and all the participants across the functions, because remember, there's cascading business processes in the life cycle of an order. And in a TMS, you can see timing of events. You can see data streams, what's missing and what's there. You have all this visibility that comes through the operations and the back-end business analytics that help you understand how effectively your plan is performing and which elements of that plan are underperforming, and it allows for correction and improvement. You just simply can't do that without a tool. The level of sophistication that is required from a transportation strategy today just makes it impossible to manage all the data inputs, the timing of events, and the variables without really a TMS.
Yeah, no, obviously I agree. I mean, I've been, looking at the TMS market now for over 18 years. And if you look at, what are some of the hot areas in TMS today, and what, both users are looking for and the vendor community is providing, number one, a lot more interest in business intelligence and analytics capabilities, right? To do just what you just talked about is to be able to, grab all this data that they've been historically collecting, but how do you derive insights out of that then can lead to, smarter and faster, decisions, right? To keep pace with, the realities of the transportation environment. And then optimization, which is something that, historically a lot of companies said, we'll get to optimization in phase 2 of our TMS implementation. They put in kind of the automation and the automated tendering and all that. And it's great, right? To kind of reduce on the manual processing. But now they're recognizing that, hey, you know what? This is getting so complex. And now, now we're using parcel, and we never used parcel before, right? Now we're much more global, right? So now we're using ocean and we're using intermodal. So now that it's reached a level of complexity where now they're looking at optimization and some of the technology going on there. And of course, you've got some of the sexiness of machine learning and artificial intelligence that's coming on board as well. And I think that's where, to your point, it is a critical pillar that helps, support the other ones as well.
And I think when you talked about the machine learning piece and such, I think this is the dawn of a whole new value proposition. Without the TMS, to your point, if you don't have that as a foundational element of your transportation execution and improvement, you can't even get what is coming next, the predictive analytics, right? And the prescriptive elements that come from that. I know that's where we're spending a lot of time here and working with our clients, is that visibility to their global supply chain and predicting where are there going to be disruptions, predicting where there's opportunities unmet, right? So that it's not just now reflection, it's real time, to your point, optimization, it's real time guidance, as it were, to disruptions. And how do you then, and the recommendations, the prescriptive piece, how do you decide what are the alternate routes I can take to mitigate this predicted risk, right? So that's really where the future is. And without the TMS and without having all your strategies and your processes well documented and orchestrated, it's very difficult to leverage that next evolution that we're talking about here.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, again, if you're managing your operations with spreadsheets and clipboards and paper and whiteboards, you're going to, if you're not struggling now, you're definitely going to struggle significantly, moving forward. So Steve, we're kind of running short on time here, so I've got just a couple of more questions. I mean, so, what new or additional research questions are you exploring, especially as it relates to, enabling a successful transportation experience?
One of the things that we've got going right now is really, we just finished one in the truckload space that we're about to publish, but when you take a look at supplier strategies, what are leader shippers doing versus laggard shippers? Who's getting the best performance? What are the attributes of their supplier relationship? So the hint of a future paper we have coming out here soon is leaders tend to rationalize their supplier base, so they get to a smaller supplier base. All the suppliers within that rationalized base have a very clear strategy. You can see that in the route guide and how they perform. And quite frankly, this sounds a little self-promotional, but we're seeing the use of brokerage as an actual strategy within the portfolio. And part of that goes to, you need the breadth of the marketplace of carriers, small and large, and it's difficult to manage thousands of relationships. And I think that's what it amounts to is where do you use the small carrier community effectively? So that's a current one. And then we're doing the same type of thing in the LTL industry. So what are the leader community compared to the lagger community, shippers, the performance they get from LTL? What are the attributes and strategies that we see showing up? So that's an active project as well.
Great. Well, definitely look forward to the output of that research. I'll always enjoy kind of getting the insights there. So as a way to wrap up, I mean, in light of everything that we've talked about today, I mean, what steps should companies take to, improve their transportation experience? I mean, where do they begin? And, is there a particular pillar that's, more important than the other, or the right starting point?
Well, I think if they're not today, if they don't have a whole holistic strategy like we're speaking of, I think what you can do right away is take a look at your procurement cycle. How old is your pricing? How frequently you go to market? I would say that's a key one. Fresh pricing matters, especially in a tense market like this. Secondly is anything you can do to smooth out demand. That demand volatility of tenders to the community, that shows up in all of our research probably as a lead attribute to getting your service providers to accept the tenders, the providers you want at the price you want. So maybe, what it comes down to is going through some of those research things. Can you influence dwell? How long it takes you to load or unload a truck? Because that's a business process in your dock you can control, as example. So I think lead time, freshness of pricing, and dwell. These are things you could probably do right away within transportation without having to do some of the broader strategies maybe, and then work your way into some of the other ideas.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think, really focusing on those areas that you can have, you have the most control over in many cases, and really have the biggest impact, makes a lot of sense. Well, Steve, as I always say at the end of all our episodes, we always just manage to scratch the surface on these topics. But I think that we, provided some great insight on, these four, pillars, and provided some, great advice here for, shippers to, take to heart, as we move forward here into 2018, and, what promises to be a very challenging and, exciting, transportation market. So thank you very much for making the time to be with us today.
Thanks, Adrian.
And thank you to those of you that joined us. If you're watching this episode on demand, either at the C.H. Robinson website or on Talking Logistics, and you've got a question or comment for Steve, you can post it there, and I'm sure that he'll be more than happy to respond via that medium. Again, Absolutely. Thank you all for joining us today. Look forward to seeing the future episodes of Talking Logistics. Have a great day.
Thank you.